Whenever we talk about failures, we often so there are great books like Good to Great, and basically we celebrate success, right? We celebrate success and we shame failures, right? So if you are a startup, and I think you touched upon in your book as well, that many times you basically you push it further. You have no end in sight. You keep pursuing it. How do you, like, when you look at startups where the idea of failure is sort of looked up or frowned upon when it comes to your progression? When you study failures for startups, like where do your mind come at peace at this? Whether it's a opportunity to learn and pivot, or whether it's a shameful deceit that you have to run away from and not fail.
Yeah, the stigma of failure varies a great deal by culture. So I think it's stigmatized everywhere. People in the United States, particularly on the coasts, right, West Coast and East Coast, will say that it's tolerated, and I think in fact it is tolerated to a greater extent than in other parts of the world. I mean, you don't want to be a failure in Japan or France. I just gave a presentation to the Harvard clubs in India and heard that in India it's very difficult to fail, and people will hide it and avoid it if they can. So, but then, you look at the United States. I would say China has a pretty aggressive entrepreneurial culture, and in some ways very similar to the United States. So it does vary, and we also should draw a distinction between failures, daily failures along the way. I mean, every individual, every business has small failures, and a goal should be to learn from those, and draw the distinction between those and the big failure, the one that leads to the extinction of the organization. And so that's what the book is about. The book is not about the small failures; it's about the big one, the one that ends the venture. What's tricky about learning from failure is philosophers would tell you the only way you learn is if you can fail, right? If everything goes according to plan, and it's not obviously you've learned anything new, right? You had a plan, it worked. You were exactly. I mean, maybe you have more confidence in your plan now. Maybe your assumptions, you have more confidence in your assumptions about cause and effect relationships, but you haven't learned much. When something fails, either in a small way or a big way, now you have to figure out, okay, I had some assumptions and they were wrong. So what went wrong? And it forces you to go on a quest to sort of figure out, was it something you did? Was it a mistaken sense of cause and effect? And the trick with the big failure, the failure that ends the company, is it can often take years. And so we learn best from failure when feedback cycles are fast. You make a move and you quickly get feedback on whether it was a smart move or not a smart move. And you learn best when you have repeated cycles. And you learn best when you have a clear sense of cause and effect relationship. So weather forecasting is a fantastic example, right? You make a forecast every day, sometimes several times a day, and you find out the next day or the next week whether you were right or not. Meteorologists have this entire system of hypotheses about what moves the weather. So, and in fact, weather forecasters get better and better over time. Stock picking a little bit like this, but much noisier cause and effect relationships, so harder to learn. The problem with an entrepreneurial venture is it can last 5 or 10 years before it either succeeds or fails. And like in any complicated human organization, there's a lot going on. So, and some of the relationships are nonlinear. So, you push on something and, and you have no idea what's going to get pushed in the distant future or so. And so it's hard for an entrepreneur to, and also there are very few repeated trials, right? Since an entrepreneur may only do this 3 times in their life. So, to learn from one failure is a very challenging thing. That's why vicarious learning is important. And when we study failure, if you go into domains like firefighting, or weather forecast, air traffic control is a good place, right? The National Traffic and Air Safety Commission will look at near misses and really analyze them in detail. And pilots learning to fly will study those carefully, because if somebody gets into trouble and then you can actually figure out what they did to prevent the trouble, that's very powerful. So the book is very much in that spirit of vicarious learning. Learn from other people's entrepreneurial failure, so you don't have to go through it yourself.
Interesting. So when I think you had a very interesting point. So I was thinking about, so I was discussing with one of the executives at WeWork a couple of months back about whatever happened with the WeWork story. Obviously, so they're beyond the startup stage, they're doing really good, and then suddenly, so they were a very good example of failures, right? So there were failures
It's
early on.
Spectacular and an epic failure.
Yeah, so they keep on pushing it, because sometimes it's good to not look at the failures and keep investing in where you're succeeding, right? And then that bubble keeps on increasing to a level where it's beyond anyone's control, and then it bursts, right? So when you I'm curious about your vantage point. So when you are, say, dealing with a startup, and there's a 2 purviews. One purview is, okay, I can see failures, but I can see progress. So let me just focus on the progress. We'll deal with the failure later. And then these hockey stick growth, and you talked about it, when things are working, then you don't know where you have failed. So you have not learned your lessons, due lessons. So what is your what's your take on that?
So if we look at WeWork in particular, I think WeWork is a classic example of a failure pattern in the book. The book is built around 6 failure patterns. 3 are early stage startups, first couple of years when the venture is still trying to find a product and a market that fit, and mobilizing resources, team and money and so forth. And then 3 of the failure patterns are late stage. We've got resources, we're growing, but the question is, can we continue to grow and grow profitably? And it turns out, sort of 2 out of 3 early stage startups fail. It's still the case that 1 out of 3 late stage startups fail to make money for the investors. So that's one yardstick for failure, is the investors don't get their money back. And WeWork is a classic example of that. I mean, I think it's fair. I mean, who knows? It may rebound and someday be worth $80 billion again. But it doesn't seem very likely, does it? So the people who put money in at a very, very high valuation a couple of years ago are probably never going to get that money back. And in that sense, it is a failure. And I think it's an example of a failure pattern I call speed trap. So just like the policeman with the radar gun at the side of the road, and the speed limit is 40 miles an hour and you're going 65, you can get in trouble. And growth is a tricky thing. It's one of, what you asked, what surprised me about failure. It turns out sometimes the things you need to do to succeed as an entrepreneur, grow, are also the things that can cause you to fail as an entrepreneur, grow too fast, grow unprofitably. And I mean, in some ways, because Adam was such a charismatic founder, he was able to dazzle investors and raise money at a gigantic valuation by painting this vision of a future that was very compelling. But really, if you dug into it, they were leasing real estate and sort of dividing it into smaller pieces and releasing it, hopefully at a higher price.